During the Great Depression, a small group of people, mostly writers, combed the countryside for the government, collecting the stories of everyday Americans.
Now listen here, folks, and it ain't no joke. We've got to do something or we all gonna croak. We can't get a job, we've all been robbed. We've got no money and the corn's all cob. We've nothing but blues, the breadline blues.
The writers were hired by the Works Progress Administration, or WPA for short, a New Deal program created to give people jobs. But what were they doing, and why?
The WPA was building roads, and it was creating really the beginnings of our federal park systems. This was a really sweeping federal program in just about every state.
Greg Kimball is a historian with the Library of Virginia. He works with the library's collection of WPA materials.
I think they went a step further in a really interesting way. They said, well, there are cultural workers out there, right? And they created the opportunities for those people to also take part in the WPA. And probably the most unique piece of it is this idea that it was really worth documenting the experience of the average person, just regular people, factory workers, and farmers, and women and men, and notably African Americans, particularly here in Virginia.
A few of the staff on the Federal Writers Project were African Americans, documenting Black life even as they lived in the Jim Crow South. They were like undercover historians on a dangerous mission, and though they didn't realize it at the time, they were laying the groundwork for future explorations. Which takes us to 80 years later and to the rolling hills around Charlottesville, Virginia.
Volunteers were going into the woods to document the locations of small family burial grounds in the county. Maybe I should start over. Since quarantine, I really haven't talked that much.
That's Kiki Petrocino. By day, she directs the creative writing program at the University of Virginia. On her own time, she travels with her mother, trying to learn more about her family's history in the Commonwealth. She found that even today, documenting Black history is not easy.
My mother and I took a trip to the Louisa County Historical Society. We found a binder that had photographs of many burial sites. That's where we found that they had photographed a small burial plot that my great-great-grandfather had begun on land that had once belonged to him.
Petrocino was using the types of skills that had been used by WPA writers during the Great Depression: interviewing, digging into old archives, following maps to landmarks. Research in hand, Petrocino and her mother ventured into the unknown, looking for her family history in a lost graveyard buried deep in the forest.
We decided to go drive out there and see if we could find any burial sites. The problem is that I didn't grow up in a rural environment. My mother and I had no idea how to really approach the idea of finding these graves in the woods. And so we went as far into the woods as we dared, but then quickly became pretty disoriented and had to find our way out. I ended up going back to the opening cantos of Dante's Inferno in my mind, where Dante finds himself on the road in the midst of a dark wood, and the path forward, the right path is lost, and he cannot go any further, And that's kind of how I felt.
That's a feeling I'm familiar with. And reopening those lost pathways is something I have been committed to my entire life. I'm your host, Chris Haley. I'm an archivist, actor, and writer. I've been passionate about history since I was a kid, when I was inspired by my uncle, Alex Haley, who wrote a book about finding family roots, which was called Roots. You might have heard of it. But even with all the work we've done, there are still mysteries in my family. Mysteries I feel strongly when I'm in cemeteries. This is The People's Recorder, the podcast that explores the work of the Federal Writers Project, a WPA program that set out to document the United States and ended up creating its first national self-portrait. In the 1930s, the Federal Writers Project was uncovering local history on a big scale. Writers set to work in every state in the Union.
I was born in East Virginia.
And in Virginia, From the outskirts of Washington, D.C. to the state's southwestern tip in the Blue Ridge Mountains, hundreds of people were researching stories of Virginia life. These stories were being collected for a Virginia State Guidebook, part of the WPA's American Guide series. Most of the unemployed recruits were white, but there were about a dozen black writers and researchers who were hired for what was then called the Negro Studies Project. This group did groundbreaking work, digging for stories that were on the verge of being erased forever. What they found would help upend the way we tell American history and lay the groundwork for the civil rights movement. Yet, they are almost unknown today. Let's take a step back. The Federal Writers Project had a mandate from Congress to document life from a local perspective. In the words of the project's national director, Henry Alsberg, in each state, the staff working with local individuals is gathering unique and important material. A great deal of real American writing comes out of seeing what is really happening to the American people. But which people? And whose story was being told? In Virginia, people of color were left out of the plan at first.
In African American communities, many of them were already struggling, right? Because of the kind of systematic disinvestment in their communities that was Jim Crow.
Julian Hayter is a historian and a professor of leadership studies at the University of Richmond. Throughout his career, he has studied the history of race in America, and especially in Virginia.
Some African Americans probably would have asked you in the 1930s, what depression? In large part because of the difficulties that they had to endure in the decades after emancipation. And that was, of course, made worse, not just by the Depression, but by the manner in which the federal government left it up to states to disseminate New Deal infrastructure when the federal government finally decided to help people after they saved the banks and try to resuscitate the economy. So what we see in many instances throughout the 1930s are African American communities suffer more than their white counterparts in large part because their white counterparts were responsible for orchestrating the New Deal on a state and local level.
But in Virginia, there were powerful voices who were committed to changing that.
Somebody we need to give some credit to is a man named Thomas Calhoun Walker, T.C. Walker. He was a teacher, a lawyer, important figure in Black political and cultural circles. And he approached the local state folks and there were no Black people who were working on the Virginia Writers Project. He wanted to change that.
T.C. Walker knew the value of Black history. Hell, he had lived it. Born into slavery in 1862, he became the first African American to practice law in Gloucester County in 1887. 4 years later, he got into politics. Walker was one in a line of Black leaders who took action to get the story of Black history in Virginia told. And he saw the Writers Project as a chance to do that.
T.C. Walker had already been doing some work in Virginia, and I think he provides the necessary momentum. He really is the guy who is trying to compile a kind of encyclopedic body of knowledge on Black people in Virginia.
In 1934, President Roosevelt appointed Walker as a consultant on Negro affairs for the Virginia Emergency Relief Administration. Walker, nicknamed the Black Governor of Virginia, worked closely with Sterling Brown, a Howard University professor and director of the National Black Studies Initiatives for the Writers Project.
Sterling Brown, so he was a respected scholar before the WPA shows up and decides that Black voices are worthy of being cataloged. By mid-1930s, Brown comes in and says, hey, we can do this work.
Brown and Walker created the Negro Studies Project, as it was called, based out of the Hampton Institute, now Hampton University. Hampton is a historically Black college located at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. The institute had a strong academic reputation and included Booker T. Washington among its graduates. And whether intentional or not, the institute was also a symbolic place from which to organize the new Negro Studies Project.
Hampton is ground zero, right? And it had been for a while, with Virginia Union, Hampton, those institutions essentially rise from the ashes of emancipation. So there's this burgeoning intellectual culture at Hampton, way before the 1930s.
At Hampton, The legacy of slavery and emancipation is in plain sight. Steps away from the campus is Point Comfort, where the first Africans enslaved in America landed in 1619. And looming over the Hampton entrance is a centuries-old tree known as the Emancipation Oak. In its shade, formerly enslaved families learned to read and write. And in 1863, that same oak was the site of the first Southern reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. Students passed by, and still pass by, that oak every day.
My grandfather grew up in Hampton and has a long connection. We would spend vacations down in Hampton. For many years, I spent Thanksgiving with my family in Hampton.
Audrey Davis directs the Black History Museum in Alexandria. Her grandfather was a friend of Sterling Brown's at Howard University. For her, Hampton embodied the path from slavery to education.
I just remember people like Sterling and my grandfather just having an elegance about them. And I think because of segregation and the way African Americans were perceived, I just always remember them in suits and ties, always formally dressed. And I know Sterling smoked a pipe and my grandfather smoked a pipe, so smell of pipe tobacco. And they're having cocktails together just in my grandparents' living room and speaking with my grandmother. It was just a history lesson hearing that. And I wish I had recorded these stories or could remember them, because they both loved to tell stories and they were both very good storytellers. We've all been involved in the arts or museums in some way, and I think it comes from a strong sense in our family of preserving African American history and not letting that important history, those family stories, fade.
Preserving these stories was foremost in Sterling Brown's mind. And in Hampton, he found a kindred spirit in a 32-year-old professor named Roscoe Lewis, who was tasked with leading the Negro Studies project in Virginia. At first glance, he didn't seem like the obvious choice. Roscoe Lewis was actually a chemistry professor, but his first love was Black history. He was a friend and colleague of Sterling Brown. Both men were using the federal mandate to hunt for evidence they knew would soon disappear. When Roscoe Lewis took the job of director of the Virginia Negro Studies Project, he knew he was tasked with documenting Black life and history in a Virginia that still whitewashed that history. He had in many ways a thankless job. One of the goals of the Writers' Project was to encourage local travel with a series of guidebooks called The American Guides. But as travelers, Black Americans faced a very different reality. In the racially charged landscape of segregation, one wrong step could get you killed. The Virginia Guide doesn't mention lynching in its 800-plus pages. The book notes briefly the huge gap between salaries of white and Black school teachers, but that's as close as it comes to addressing Virginia's system of racial segregation.
Here I go, right back in jail again. I don't have any money.
The so-called Negro Unit faced the resistance of white state officials and the public, but they were committed to recovering the threads of Black history. That meant digging deep and rummaging through archives and census records. Lewis and his team were probing a landscape of silences. There were just so few documents of their ancestors' lives and contributions. This was the same challenge that poet Kiki Petrocino faced as she was researching her own family's history.
There's all this silence in the historical record that comes from the history of oppression and disenfranchisement, enslavement, the chattel slavery system that we had here in the United States. 1870 is usually either it's a brick wall or it's a gate. If you try to go back to 1860, well, then you're prior to the Civil War, right? We're on the eve of the Civil War. And everybody who was enslaved was still enslaved at that time. And they didn't count as people or citizens, they counted as property. And so all of those names suddenly dissolve from the historical record as you go backwards in time. 1870 is the first census in which the newly freed enslaved, those who were not free Blacks before the Civil War, right? So like the majority of Black people are finally enumerated in the census as citizens, as people with names and surnames and places of birth and little check marks for whether they can read or write and little scrawled descriptions of what they did as an occupation. But then there are these silences that started to feel to me in researching my family where it started to feel a little bit like an intentional silence, that ancestors themselves had not put themselves into the historical record in certain ways because they chose other ways to put themselves into the historical record.
Petrocino wrote about her one-sided dialogue with her ancestors. She imagined them explaining their silence in her poem, Message from the Free Smiths of Louisa County.
Okay, now which message poem was it? Okay, cool. 72. Message from the Free Smiths of Louisa County. You ask why we didn't register as required, why we failed to appear before the provost marshal, why we avoided the courthouse, the census, the bank. You ask where we sheltered while battles seethed, where our mothers gave birth, in which hidden houses, and why we didn't register as required. How did we manage? We avoided the courthouse, the census, the bank. Whatever we had, we held. Whatever we knew, we told no one who counted. We kept back our names. We didn't register as required. When you search for us now, you find silence. You may trace us back to a moment, no further. We chose inward passages. We kept deep counsel. We didn't register as required, which disappoints you. Why do you trust the courthouse, the census, the bank?
That poem is from Kiki Petrocino's award-winning book, White Blood, where she describes looking for her ancestors' lives in Virginia. When conventional research tools failed her, she had to find a different way into those stories. She could personally relate to the difficulties faced by Roscoe Lewis during the 1930s. With limited records, Lewis and his team also tried a new approach to history. They began talking with people across the state who could speak to the experience of Black Virginians. And in their work, they kept one group clearly in view, the survivors of slavery. Many were still alive even 70 years after the Civil War. His team of investigators traveled with makeshift audio recorders or pen and paper, seizing the rare opportunity to hear from people who survived those harrowing times. The interviewing tools that came from project headquarters in Washington were not ideal. They included directives to write speech in dialect and long, cumbersome lists of questions that were not likely to be answered. So Roscoe Lewis and his cohorts adapted their own questions, and they worked hard to build trust with the elders who shared their stories. In Petersburg, one of the investigators was a woman named Susie R.C. Bird.
Susie R.C. Bird, she was a teacher, and she had been involved previously in another New Deal project. She has a nice 8-page summary of her life and how she came to do her interviews. It's funny because hers is in the third person. She talks about herself. And being, an African-American in Petersburg herself and a teacher, she knew a lot of people.
Sue Bird was assigned as federal writer for the Petersburg district of the Negro Federal Writers Project of Virginia. Her job was to collect data concerning the history of Petersburg Negroes. Petersburg is a very rich sector historically for Negroes, and Miss Berg, knowing this, quickly, quote, let down her bucket, quote, where she was. For 2 blocks away from her home lived a settlement of approximately 40 ex-slaves. Susie Bird.
Petersburg had a large population of free people of color, and it was an industrial town, really. I mean, it looked a lot like Richmond, lots of tobacco factories and iron foundries and things of that sort.
Unlike many of the white staff on the Writers Project, Susie Bird had no access to a typewriter. She wrote out her interviews longhand on legal-sized paper. Yet, she was innovative in her approach, meeting with her interviewees in groups, recording them singing songs, a powerful chorus.
The first ex-slave group was called at the time set by Reverend Brown and his wife. At this meeting, there were about 40 ex-slaves. I wrote interviews which were very long. They sang slave songs, then each one told a story that they remembered. They asked to come every Wednesday, meeting at a different house each time.
Kiki Petrocino encountered the fruits of Bird's work and the slave narratives when she was a girl.
I have this flashback all of a sudden to middle school. When I was one of the only African American students in a small Catholic school, I felt displaced and I felt pretty othered. And I remember carrying around this little book, and it was a book called To Be a Slave. The book itself contained abridgments of text from the Federal Writers Project. I remember just reading through them as if I were reading stories. There was the vivid depictions of time spent as an enslaved person. I remember carrying that little book around school and reading it and rereading it until it became a tattered paperback. And that must have primed me to read these other accounts taken during the Federal Writers Project when I was older. There was a uniqueness and a specificity to that material that drew me in to a world, and I wanted to read more and more.
My master had about 500 slaves. He'd never sell none of his slaves, but he'd always buy more. When you're married, you had to jump over a broom 3 times. If master seen 2 slaves together too much, he would marry them. It didn't make no difference if you weren't 14 years old. Georgia Gibbs.
I remember reading those accounts too. They are unique and at times brutally honest. Although project workers in other states were also interviewing those who had been enslaved, there was something different about the work being done in Virginia. Greg Kimball from the Library of Virginia filled us in on why Virginia's interviews were so different.
One of the things that was unique about Virginia is that the majority of the interviews were done by African-American interviewers, and that was not that common. Obviously, this is a time of Jim Crow, segregation, and repression, and Black people are not going to reveal themselves or their inner thoughts to white people. And it's a huge difference to have Susie R.C. Byrd and several other African-Americans who are involved in this work. One anecdote, which I think gives you some sense of the difference between a white interviewer versus a Black interviewer. There was an elderly gentleman in the group who was telling stories, and Susie R.C. Byrd had brought her white supervisor to the meeting because she was interested in Byrd's work and wanted to kind of see what it was all about. And this gentleman happened to be blind, and he was telling various stories. And at their next meeting, he kind of chided her and said, if I'd known that white woman was here, I don't know if I would have said all the things that I said.
In Petersburg, Susie Byrd and Roscoe Lewis sat down with survivor Annie Williams at her home. At age 100, Williams sang when they recorded her in 1937.
I got the flag, long ways away, over Union boys, but I won't say. The troopers in Richmond, but they wailed mighty what was harmony, two drums.
For equipment, Lewis and Byrd had to catch as catch can, and the sound quality wasn't always up to scratch. Songs and oral histories were fuel for a book that Lewis and his small team in Hampton were writing. Titled The Negro in Virginia, this was to be the first in a national series of books planned by Sterling Brown that would give Americans a glimpse into the realities of Black life across the country. Today, The Negro in Virginia can be a problematic title. It sounds backward, but the title belies the revolutionary work of its content. In the book, Roscoe Lewis and Sterling Brown pieced together history from sparse written records complemented by personal experiences. Both men knew how important it was to document these voices before it was too late. In the chapter titled The Narrators, Lewis introduced the formerly enslaved interviewees with the following passage. Soon, the last person who has known what it meant to be a slave will have died. There are questions about the slave system that can be answered only by one who has experienced slavery. How did it feel to be owned? What were their pleasures and sufferings? Did they feel it was their right to be free? Susie Byrd, the WPA interviewer, recalled how Lewis interacted with her sources. In her words,
Our supervisor, Roscoe Lewis, grew anxious to visit this group. We had 50 present. Stories were told, interviews taken, and ex-slaves' songs sung.
Stomp it down, stomp down freedom, stomp it down, stomp down freedom, stomp it down.
The supervisor was very much impressed. The ex-slaves liked, quote, that little man. Brother Massey said he took so much pains with us.
Stomp it down, stomp down freedom, stomp it down, stomp down freedom, stomp it down, stomp down freedom.
In all the records made at Sister Brown's house, her husband's voice stands out clearly above all the rest.
Among the hurdles Lewis and his team faced were skeptics, including their white colleagues on the Writers' Project, who just could not accept some of the stories that were coming out of the interviews. The editor of the WPA Guide to Virginia was named Eudora Richardson. She encouraged Lewis's work, but she balked at parts of what they called the slave narratives. She thought at least one story of brutality was, as she called it, a gross exaggeration.
We're talking about Eudora Ramsey Richardson, who was the supervisor of the project. And there was a narrative, I believe it was in West Point, Virginia, in the Tidewater area, about a woman whose jaw had been crushed, I believe under a rocker, intentionally.
As Lewis wrote, Henrietta King bears the scars of slavery on her face. Her face is a hideous mask, her mouth horribly twisted across one cheek with the jagged fangs of rotted teeth protruding. One cheek is speckled with lumps, ends of the jawbones, she explains. She says she has no idea what she looked like before her face was smashed.
There are various letters of Mrs. Richardson who read this and simply thought this can't possibly be so. And she went out and met the woman, and it was so.
Lewis took Richardson to West Point, Virginia, and introduced her to the 98-year-old Henrietta King. After hearing and seeing the horrible truth with her own eyes, Richardson relented, and the story was printed in its entirety. Stories like these began to reveal a raw and authentic picture of slavery in Virginia. After much editorial back and forth, The Negro in Virginia finally came out in June 1940. Roscoe Lewis's name was on the preface. It read, "It is appropriate that the first WPA state book on the Negro be produced in Virginia. For here the first African natives were brought and held in enforced servitude. In a real sense, the story of the Negro in Virginia is also the story of the American Negro. It has been our aim to tell impartially of the springs that watered those roots and of the droughts that withered them." Handsomely published in 1940, The Negro in Virginia clocked in at over 400 pages.
It got incredible press. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois praised it highly in a review. It was a Book of the Month Club selection. H.L. Mencken in the American Mercury praised it. It was a really amazing accomplishment for its time and still absolutely worth reading. It really is a really fine piece of scholarship.
If you know anything about Du Bois, he was a tough critic, and he loved the story.
As a historian of African American history, Julian Hayter can't stress enough the importance of the Negro in Virginia.
It informs generations of scholarship that helped get us to now. And Du Bois recognized that, right? This book was well received. So the Commonwealth really does pioneer kind of institutionalizing Blackness, if you will, and slavery and the relationship between the two. And these are really the first pioneers to bring this story forward. They are centralizing the story of race to the American story. If there's a major contribution in the Negro of Virginia, it's that.
Placed alongside the WPA Guide to Virginia, a big hardback book but with a whitewashed view of history, The Negro in Virginia, in contrast, makes a striking statement. It shows a past fully alive with the African American experience.
They wrote this book in many ways as a proverbial middle finger. I mean, the book starts off in 1619. If you read The Negro in Virginia, there's nothing novel about the 1619 project, right? So what we begin to see is these are the people who know how absolutely essential Black life was to the establishment of the Commonwealth of Virginia. This is an attack on mythology, and I think it's ironic that it's African Americans who actually write a more comprehensive history of the Commonwealth of Virginia and not their white counterparts, because they're not respected as intellectuals. Yet it's they who actually come to the table with more history than heritage.
Unfortunately, in the end, The Negro in Virginia was the only volume to appear in the series that Sterling Brown had planned. Politics and budget cuts shut down the Federal Writers Project in 1939. That left it to the states to wrap up the state guides that remained. Many did, but only the Virginia office was able to publish the book that focused on African American life. And the audience for the history they documented has steadily grown and has inspired other efforts to reclaim African American history.
What is the old saying, hunger's the best chef? I'm sure this book was devoured by any number of literate African Americans who wanted to know more about their history.
Which brings our story back to where we started, to African American burial grounds.
New tonight, for the past 60 years, thousands of African Americans' graves in one cemetery have sat unnamed and unmarked. Their headstones were sold for scrap or thrown into the Potomac River.
Gravestones, once gone from where their namesakes were buried, are headed home.
August 2021. Governor Ralph Northam of Virginia, Governor Larry Hogan of Maryland, and D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser meet for an act of reparation and restoration.
It's really important for all of us to acknowledge past wrongs.
It's a disgraceful and heartbreaking chapter in our history.
We talked today about recovering these headstones and memorializing them properly. What we're really talking about is how we tell the stories of not just this action, but this time, in the times before that.
Sadly, this story was not an isolated incident. For decades, many African American cemeteries were neglected or forgotten or overrun by land developers. But now, local communities are restoring and protecting Black cemeteries. They are finding that burial grounds are not just hallowed spaces where we remember those we've lost. They are critical places in our culture and history. In the process, these groups are gaining control of their stories. To poet Kiki Petrocino, this story is about recovering spaces that have long been lost.
It's frustrating, it's saddening. So many elements of the landscape in Virginia have been preserved. You can drive along a road that you know was an old wagon road. There are Civil War battlefields that are preserved, for example, and you can see what the battlefield would have looked like back then. There are plantation houses, there are churches, chapels, burial sites. There are Confederate burial sites that have gotten public money for their maintenance over the years. But there were aspects of my family's history that were, if not lost, then in the process of being erased by time.
Petrocino is haunted by the erasures of history. She wrote about her search for the past in a poem titled Approaching the Smith Family Graveyard.
As a poet, to think about that time, to do this type of research means learning how to read in their way, or at least learn how to write a poem that talks about how it feels to read in a different way. Approaching the Smith family graveyard, flushed with notions of freedom, you follow the old wood road to its end. Butler's acreage opens up behind fence posts, a spill of storybook umber. Even the light between birches feels thicker now, flushed with notions of freedom. For a moment, you wonder if the land will dissolve before you can rush forward. Then you're over the fence, on Butler's acreage. Freedom is old here, despite the long aisles of trail cameras looking down from their graying trunks. What can harm you on Butler's acreage?
In the tidewater town of Cortland, these stories stretch back over a century. Alton Darden and his brother Maurice, along with Dolores Peterson, are trustees of the Helping Hand Cemetery. The neatly trimmed cemetery was started by their ancestors formerly enslaved citizens of Cortland in 1897. We caught up with the three of them on Zoom.
He's on mute.
Oh, there it is. Finally. Yeah. Now, my mother, who's buried there, would always say, you know, I need some money to help get the cemetery grass cut. She was the one who always made sure that we stayed connected with Cortland, the cemetery. The cemetery has really awakened me to a whole lot of things.
They say there are around 700 people that we know are interred in that cemetery. We only have record of less than probably 500 people. He bought a machine out, and it was a GPR, ground penetrating radar. And as we went through the grounds, we found there were 172 unmarked graves. So the indications are there are people buried on top of each other.
My family took us into the cemetery to clean off the graves of our ancestors. And we always have this one particular great aunt who tells you the stories of everyone. We also had something that occurs in most African-American cemeteries is people buried who had no headstones, who had no vaults. When I was young, my great-grandmother would take us in there and give us shovels, the kids' shovels, and tell us to make mounds at these special places. And she would say, this is where grandpa and grandma are buried. So from the time that I was a child, I knew to go into the cemetery, make these mounds, because if we didn't, then no one would ever know where these people were buried. At first, it was the history of the cemetery, but as we got to know other names of the different families, we said, wait a minute, the history of the African-American community of the late 1800s is told right here in this cemetery. We got a picture of what that community looked like. And I, for one, always had an issue with the only Black history of Cortland, Virginia is told through the eyes of the Nat Turner trial. And I said, you know what? Our ancestors started this community, whether they were slaves, Native Americans, free men, they started a thriving Black community. We've just been working collectively to improve all aspects of the cemetery and to transform it into an actual educational place so that when visitors come and our family members come, they can learn not only about who's buried in the cemetery, but let's look at the community from which these people who are buried here came. And that's the important thing, because there's no written record about this first community in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and all of the wonderful things they were able to do despite Jim Crow, despite being in a very segregated town of Cortland, okay, they were able to thrive. And we're here as a result of that. That's when we decided, look, we need to make sure we continue this. These people are starving for this kind of education.
Dolores is onto something. People do want to know. These initiatives connect us to our families, to our communities, to our past. With a grant from Virginia Humanities, the Helping Hand Cemetery Club is doing the work of watering the roots of the community by sharing its history and conducting remembrance interviews.
I'm not saying that we're geniuses, but we're close, okay? Because we have people on this board that are diehard historians, and they are so deeply entrenched in this whole ancestry stuff that we're going to drive ourselves nuts.
We decided, okay, let's make May 2022, that's the 125th anniversary of the cemetery purchase. We're going to have a historical conference, and we're going to have representatives from the Native Americans, from the African American community. I can foresee my grandchildren telling their grandchildren. We're just links on this earth. And if we don't take advantage of being a link, a lot of information is lost.
In Richmond's East End Cemetery, volunteers have reclaimed graves lost to decades of neglect. In my short film, Unmarked, Richmond photographer Brian Palmer, a longtime volunteer with the cemetery, speaks of the physically demanding work.
I like it when people get down to the roots. Peel back the vines, tear up the roots. If you find a buried headstone, try and dig it out without damaging the headstone. These are one-of-a-kind historical artifacts. They're irreplaceable. We're kind of rebuilding a community's history.
With Palmer, Kiki Petrocino wrote a photo essay about East End. In her words, you hear the echoes of Roscoe Lewis's WPA unit.
East End Cemetery is full of life. Thousands of epitaphs offer portraits of the people buried there. A true friend. She lived for others. He is not dead, he is just away. You learn too about the Black-led organizations that help pay for these gravestones: Booker T. Washington School, Rosalind's Beauty Salon, Purple Aster House of Ruth. The unmistakable curves of U.S. military-issued headstones are here too. Black veterans with service dating back more than a century rest alongside teachers, pastors, homemakers, and friends. Working almost entirely by hand, the Friends of East End Cemetery have cleared about 10 acres of land and revealed more than 3,000 grave markers among the estimated 15,000 individual burial sites in the area.
In East End, as elsewhere, barriers remain and developers' plans often stand in the way. The movement to reclaim cemeteries resonates in Alexandria. There, the Black community mounted a decades-long campaign to gain recognition for the Freedman Cemetery found on the spot where a gas station had since been built. The local Friends of Freedman Cemetery organized and pushed the city to acquire land for a memorial. The gas station was removed. In 2015, this memorial was added to the National Park Service's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Audrey Davis, the director of the Alexandria History Museum, was an important part of these efforts.
The whole cemetery itself, its preservation really truly was a community effort. People didn't want to hear the history, but we had over 1,000 people show up in 2007 as we sort of rededicated that land. I really see it as a living memorial. Even though it's a cemetery, it still lives in the connections we have to the people, the families that are still here in Alexandria.
Julian Hayter links the movement today for recovering Black cemeteries to the earlier movement in the 1930s to gather the voices and histories of the formerly enslaved.
After emancipation, Black people are tax-paying citizens, right? But that money's not being remunerated into their communities, right? So the infrastructure, their tax dollars are essentially being diverted to other communities to prop them up, right? While many of these cemeteries and these parks, that's public property. So I think it exists in a kind of bigger picture. Hey, look, it's not just this. It's all of these things that get us to now, if you will.
That bigger picture is what Roscoe Lewis and his team at the Negro Studies Project were putting together. For that, they pored over historical documents, and they also sought the primary sources left out of those documents, from tombstones and the voices of people who many wanted to leave in the past. They needed all of it.
It's nothing short of remarkable that someone recognized the urgency in getting these voices down on record before they were gone. Because you know damn well someone down the line would try to say this stuff never happened. And that's precisely the history that they're writing against.
In July 1864, my master's regiment captured a gang of Yankee soldiers and brought them into camp. I didn't know what the war was all about, nor why they were fighting. But when the rebels were out on the battlefield, we got a chance to talk to the Yankee prisoners. They explained to us about slavery and freedom. They told us if we got a chance to steal away from camp and got over on the Yankee side, we would be free. They said if the Yankees win, all your colored folks will be free. They said if the rebels win, you will always be slaves. Those words got into our heads. We got together, 5 of us, and decided to take a chance one night, and we made it. William Johnson.
On the streets of Charlottesville today, the hate boiling over white supremacists and countered protesters fighting with fists and clubs.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
The governor declaring a state of emergency.
Whose streets? Our streets! Whose streets? Our streets!
That was Charlottesville in 2017. The organizers of the Unite the Right rally had chosen Charlottesville because of the city's decision to remove the statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Organizers claimed that removing the statue would be like erasing a piece of American history. But how true was this history that they were trying to save? Are these statues simply memorials to an enduring American myth, this idea of the lost cause?
You know, the lost cause is being formulated during the Civil War and it gains particular momentum after the war. And it's this idea that, you know, African Americans aren't ready to be free, that the Civil War was about states' rights and not slavery, that the Confederacy was a noble cause, a particular strand of history that is still with us, by the way.
Indeed, monuments to the lost cause of the Confederacy began to pop up right after the Civil War ended. Cemeteries were among the first places that monument makers focused on. By the 1890s, the white supremacy of the lost cause and its denial of the real causes of the war were entrenched across the South, from roadside markers to city hall statues. Springing from trauma and defeat, the myth of the lost cause gained traction, and even more monuments to the Old South went up in reaction to free people of color gaining the vote and a political voice. It was especially effective recruiting fuel for groups like the Ku Klux Klan. There are a handful of isolated voices who pushed back. John Mosby, the general dubbed the Gray Ghost of Lee's cavalry, was a romantic figure for the Confederacy in the war. After the war, Mosby became a rare voice against the lost cause. In a public letter to a former Confederate comrade, Mosby warned that clinging to the lost cause was a dead end. "I don't go to reunions because I can't stand the speaking," he said. "I did change my politics because politics changed." In the 30s, white writers for the Virginia WPA Guide were susceptible to the white supremacy embedded in Virginia culture and its stories. They included historian Douglas Southall Freeman, who wrote the introduction to the Virginia Guide. He had also written a popular biography that lionized Robert E. Lee.
One of the chief orchestrators of the institutionalization of the lost cause. What is his biography of Robert E. Lee, if not a celebration, kind of leader-centric hero worship?
Greg Kimball says that white writers working on the Virginia Guide fell into a familiar pattern.
The things that got preserved tend to be things that kind of reek of the antebellum, South, the kind of mythical idea of Moonlight and Magnolia. So, even in the WPA era, they were kind of culture wars, like about what is going to be depicted. If you read the guide and some other things, there's no doubt it certainly includes many lost cause sites.
The Lee Monument, a bronze figure of the general upon his horse Traveler, stands on an ornate stone pedestal. The monument was unveiled by Lee's West Point classmate and friend, General Joseph E. Johnson, in 1890. Because the sculptor, Jean-Antoine Mercier, thought the brow of Lee too noble to be hidden under a hat, this was the first equestrian statue with a bared head erected in the United States.
The WPA guidebook had many similar descriptions that idolized lost cause sites, but things do seem to be changing.
Richmond, Virginia's towering Robert E. Lee statue taken down today, the monument of the Confederate general in what was once the capital of the Confederacy, had stood for more than 130 years.
Statues are coming down, and other monuments to the past are spurring new kinds of conversations and sparking new reflections on these landmarks. This is something Kiki Petrocino thinks about a lot, especially as he continues to seek the stories of her ancestors in Virginia.
I have yet to identify with 100% certainty the particular estates where my ancestors were held and trafficked. Places like Monticello, Montpelier, Mount Vernon, Arlington House, these big estates that, because they were associated with a president or somebody like Robert E. Lee, George Washington, they've been preserved.
Petrocino finds she's drawn to places like Montpelier or Monticello. She is making these trips to experience their contradictions.
Montpelier was the home of James Madison, the father of the Constitution and fourth president of the United States. From among ancient trees, the long two-story house faces the Blue Ridge Mountains. The numerous and very spacious reception rooms have simple white woodwork. The house was suited to the entertainment that President and Dolly Madison dispense here on a large and generous scale.
From the WPA Guide to Virginia.
I go there to think about not only about the, president or the famous general who may have lived there, but I go in search of something, some experience of the past and the present colliding. And I really do experience it as a collision of energies. Other people might find them uncomfortable places to be in, that they might not want to go to a place like Monticello because of its history of hundreds of people being enslaved there.
So you're in a perfect place to explore and learn more about Jefferson and his time. We are showing the house as it would have looked in its final form in his retirement years. Over the course of his lifetime, Jefferson enslaved over 600 men, women, and children. They were the ones who built the house, and they served members of the Jefferson family directly. And there were a lot of members.
It is uncomfortable, but there's something that I seek in that discomfort as an artist. And I find those places exhilarating to be in because of that collision.
Being open to that collision, to the discomfort of different views of history, can be hard. Greg Kimball, a historian at the Library of Virginia, points to the materials in state archives.
We would not be having this crazy conversation about quote unquote critical race theory if someone could spend a week with me looking at materials at the Library of Virginia. Because you can't deny the documentation, it's overwhelming. When you go through antebellum records on Virginia and you start to understand very quickly the enormity, for instance, of the domestic slave trade and what that actually meant for Black people, believe me, you'll have a different understanding.
The work that Roscoe Lewis and his WPA crew did urges us to take a new look at the experience of slavery in America through the words of those who lived it. They include women like Fannie Berry.
I was free a long time before I knew it. My mistress still hired me out till one day, in talking to the woman she hired me to, she, God bless her soul, told me, Fannie, you are free, and I don't have to pay your master for you now. You stay with me. She didn't give me no money, but let me stay there and work for victuals and clothes because I ain't had nowhere to go. Fannie Berry.
Those interviews are used quite heavily. Now, think of how few sources exist that are actually from the mouths of the formerly enslaved themselves. I mean, they're just not many. They're just invaluable and continue to be so. Then we have Jim Crow segregation. These are not things that should be argued about because they just happened. We have discrimination in housing. We have discrimination in employment. This is a continuum that comes right up till today. And we need to understand that the full scope of that, if we're going to grapple with the issues of race that we face now.
Just think about the sheer political will to record, what is it, like 300 former slaves? The amount of work they did in the window that they did it. I don't know what those guys were doing in those 4 years, but they obviously didn't have a life other than this project, because this is a force of nature.
You know, I think the importance of these narratives is summed up by one of my favorite writers, Ralph Ellison. You know him as the author of the powerful novel, The Invisible Man. But in 1937, Ellison was an unrooted young writer whose family was scattered by hardship. He spent his first nights in New York on a park bench. Then a friend got him a job on the Writers' Project. In the 1960s, he was speaking on a panel about the New Deal, and this is what he had to say about the work they did on the project.
Ralph Ellison has a brief comment. I just wanted to say a word in favor of the collections of regional and ethnic histories, folk say and so on, which was published during the WPA. Let's face it, there's something called official history. Perhaps it's only academic, but you couldn't find the truth about my background in that history. You couldn't. You could not find the truth about other ethnic groups. You didn't even have the truth about white Southern history.
Writers and historians alike still hold up the work of Roscoe Lewis and his small team as a crowning achievement, one that led to other breakthroughs. Pressure serves the vital function of maintaining in the Negro a realization that the American way of life is being pushed steadily, even if slowly, along a path that someday may lead to democracy. Those words were written by Roscoe Lewis. Lewis always had an inner fire that drove his work on the Writers' Project, a devotion to history as a revealing force. Decades before the Civil Rights Movement, he saw deep value in steady, subversive pressure.
It's fascinating. They were on to something 50 to 60 years before people on Twitter and social media decided that this was sexy history. I think this really does help set the stage that still holds water. Now more as a historical document, initiator, if you will, of a strain of history now that is widely accepted.
We're going to march. We're going to walk together. We're going to stand together. We're going to sing together. We're going to stay together. We're going to moan together. We're going to groan together. And after a while, we'll say, freedom, freedom, freedom now.
The Civil Rights Movement in some ways is African Americans demanding their own New Deal. And I think many of those demands are informed by work such as this. I would almost guarantee you that they help generate the urgency that inspires civil rights activism.
Roscoe Lewis went back to teaching chemistry at Hampton, but he continued to study the history and legacy of slavery for the rest of his life. Yet, his dream of publishing all 300 Virginia narratives together never became reality in his lifetime. He died in 1961 with his book not published. He was buried on the campus of Hampton. His gravestone says, "With bias towards none." The history he gathered inspired generations of activists and storytellers. As Audrey Davis, the director of the Alexandria Black History Museum, shares, all of us owe an unspoken debt to the work that they did.
They instilled that love of history. And I think that generation really was grounded in that because they didn't have it. There weren't sites where you were really honoring African Americans. And so I think my grandfather would be amazed that there's a National Museum of African American History and Culture. I know my grandfather would have spent hours in that museum. And so would Sterling Brown, and I'm sure Roscoe E. Lewis. But they helped us memorialize places by recognizing the people and what they did. So without them, we probably wouldn't know about different sites that are of importance in the African American canon.
Well, you're going to help us out with these, however.
Yes, sir. In order to preserve the songs of my childhood days. It's a farm song made up between the boys plowing on 2 or more plantations, where one would holler high-low and the other would answer with the second high-low. And that would be a signal for knocking off time. This old mule is cutting the fool. I can't get the saddle on this old mule.
There's a lot of material online now. For everything that's online, there are many thousands of pages that aren't. Believe me, we're just scratching the surface.
Way down yonder in the middle of the branch, we taught those buzzers how to dance. Hello, hello, when you're coming over.
Next time on The People's Recorder, communities in the Midwest see their lives and even their languages on the verge of extinction, and they fight back. This episode of The People's Recorder was brought to you with support from Virginia Humanities. For more about the Helping Hand Cemetery Club in Cortland, visit virginiahumanities.org. The photo essay about East End Cemetery by Brian Palmer and Kiki Petrocino appeared in the Virginia Quarterly Review. Learn more about Unmarked at unmarkedmovie.com. The episode was produced by Andrea Kalin, David Taylor, and James Mirabello. Written by David Taylor and edited by Julie Chalhoub. This is Chris Haley. Thanks for listening.